Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. This is the first webinar in the Green Bank's multi-part series called Spotlight on Residential Solar in Connecticut. Today's session is Residential Solar Investment and Deployment in Connecticut, an in-depth review of a 10-year incentive program from 2012 to 2022. My name is Rudy Stirk. I'm the Associate Director of Marketing and Communications at the Green Bank. In a moment, I will turn the presentation over to Brian Garcia, our President and CEO. But first, let's cover the agenda and a bit of housekeeping. We will start today with an overview of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. Then we'll dive into the solar market in Connecticut and the solar public policy in the state that helped enable the residential solar investment program. Then we will have a presentation from Slipstream to talk about the performance of the residential solar investment program. And we'll close with a Q&A session. So as we go through, please enter any questions that you have into the question box on the GoToWebinar. We will get to them at the end. We are also recording this session, and we'll send out a follow-up email tomorrow to everyone who registered with some links and some exciting other pieces of information. So be sure to look out for that. Without any further delay, I'm going to now turn this over to Brian Garcia, President and CEO of the Green Bank.
All right, thank you, Rudy. Good morning, good afternoon to many of you online. It's great to be with you all here today. You all are local in some contexts. There's many Connecticut stakeholders here interested in residential solar. And you're also from states and municipalities across the country interested in learning more about residential solar incentive and financing programs. So welcome. Today, we wanted to share with you an incentive program we implemented for more than a decade, and we wanted to share the lessons that we've learned in doing that. And then next month, we will delve into financing. So it will be loans in June, and then we're going to come to leases and power purchase agreements in August. We want to try to demonstrate how financing programs and products increase access to residential solar, especially for low-income and disadvantaged communities. Today, we're joined by Sergio Carrillo, our Managing Director of Incentive Programs at the Connecticut Green Bank, who will provide an overview of the residential solar investment program. And we also have Dan Straight and Lee Shaver, who are researchers with Slipstream, who will be providing an independent evaluation of that incentive program. So why don't we get started? Let's go to the next slide, Rudy. So the Connecticut Green Bank, we're the nation's first state-level green bank. We're a quasi-public organization, which essentially means we get to use private sector disciplines to achieve public sector goals, social and environmental impact. We're also an intermediary between the ambitious public policies of the state and the private markets that we're trying to help create to enable investment to achieve those public policies. Our mission is to confront climate change, and we do that by increasing and accelerating investment. Investment is the key input, and we do it to create more resilient, healthier, and equitable communities. More investment in clean energy and environmental infrastructure deployment creates the social and environmental outputs and outcomes that government is after. Since our founding in July of 2011, we've invested $320 million of public resources to mobilize more than $1.9 billion of private investment, which results in the deployment of over 500 megawatts of renewable energy, 65 million MMBTUs of energy efficiency. It helps reduce the energy costs on over 65,000 families and businesses, including those in our vulnerable communities. That investment helps create jobs, over 26,000 direct, indirect, and induced jobs in our communities. That investment helps raise tax revenues, over $110 million in sales, personal, and corporate income tax revenues for the state. And then, of course, it helps reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It's helped avoid over 10 million metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions while also helping to avoid air pollution. And in doing this, we've made the green economy more accessible and affordable to vulnerable communities. low to moderate income families, and communities of color, and helping them combat energy inflation by reducing energy consumption and choosing clean, renewable energy instead of fossil fuels. Let's go to the next slide. On August 16th of 2022, President Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act into law. As we're all beginning to see, the IRA is the largest investment from the US government ever in the modernization and decarbonization of our nation's energy infrastructure. Beyond the IRA seeking to achieve a zero carbon electric sector by 2035 and carbon neutral economy by 2050, it puts Justice 40 and just transition right alongside reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We see this in the investment tax credit requirements for prevailing wages and apprenticeships in order to receive the full 30% ITC. We see this in the adders to the tax credit for energy communities for an additional 10%, for low-income households in tribal communities, an additional 10 to 20%, for Made in America domestic content of an additional 10%. There are places here in Connecticut that have the potential to receive up to 30% from the investment tax credit. And of course, there is the $27 billion Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund administered by the Environmental Protection Agency. Let's go to the next slide. Within the IRA, and specifically Section 134A of the Clean Air Act, is the inclusion of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. Recently, the EPA released an implementation framework to assist potential applicants in preparing for the pending Notices of Funding Opportunities, or NOFOs, which we expect to be released next month. The Connecticut Green Bank is working with the American Green Bank Consortium and our partners on the $14 billion National Clean Investment Fund, which to many is the national climate bank policy the Coalition for Green Capital has been working on for more than a decade. We're also working with community lenders, community development financial institutions, credit unions, housing agencies, and others on the $6 billion Clean Communities Investment Accelerator. Today's webinar is in part focused on the $7 billion Solar for All competition, with the focus on residential solar in low-income and disadvantaged communities. Let's go to the next slide. There will be a competition for up to 60 awards to states, including territories like Puerto Rico, tribal governments, municipalities, and others to invest $7 billion through technical assistance and financial assistance. The use of these proceeds is for zero-emission technologies that are being specified by the EPA as residential solar, community solar, associated storage, and enabling upgrades. The important objectives that the EPA is after include, first, reducing greenhouse gas emissions and other air pollutants. Second, to deliver benefits to American communities, particularly low-income and disadvantaged communities. And third, to mobilize financing and private capital to stimulate additional deployment of such projects. These objectives are the Connecticut Green Bank's objectives as the nation's first state-level green bank. Let's go to the next slide. So we'd invite all of you to learn more about the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund by visiting the EPA's website. Let me now introduce Sergio Carrillo, who is going to provide an overview of the residential solar market in Connecticut. Sergio.
Thank you, Brian. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sergio Carrillo, Managing Director of Incentive Programs with the Green Bank. And I'm going to do a brief review of the residential solar market in Connecticut. In the interest of time, because we really want to get to the end of the presentation, the last slides. I'll try to be brief. You would think, let me start by saying that you would think that with a population of over 3.6 million people and 1.4 million housing units, Connecticut would not be a state that would be a good market for residential solar because of its location in the heavily forested northeastern part of the US, but it's far from true. Due to its engaged citizens and communities, ambitious state policies, and appropriate regulatory environment, and very high electricity rates, Connecticut presents a significant market for residential solar, especially in vulnerable communities. Next slide, yeah. To assess the residential solar potential for single-family homes in Connecticut, a study was conducted back in 2013. The technical potential was estimated at 6.5 gigawatts versus an economic potential of 3.9 gigawatts of installed capacity. The study concluded that approximately 3/4 of single-family homes in the state are viable for residential solar. The study also estimated PV production of almost 4,000 gigawatt hours annually, which represents roughly 15% of electric demand in Connecticut. During the 10 years of the Residential Solar Investment Program, or RSIP, administered by the Green Bank, Connecticut residents deployed roughly 385 megawatts of capacity, of solar capacity, just under 10% of the market potential identified in the study. Next slide, please. The electricity rates in Connecticut are among the highest residential rates in the continental US, something that's being exacerbated in part by the over-reliance on imported LNG to run natural gas-fired generation plants, the war in Ukraine, etc. This over-reliance on fossil fuels, especially during winter peak periods, impacts residential end-use customers, particularly low and moderate income families and communities of color, whose energy burden is increased as a result of ever-increasing electricity rates. Next slide, please. Even though Connecticut's solar resource is much less compared to sunnier states, the potential represented by the potential kilowatt hours produced per kilowatt of solar PV installed, it is because of its high electricity rates and savings potential that there is a still significant market for residential solar in the state. Next slide, please. In Connecticut, there are 169 cities and towns, each with its own unique characteristics. Housing profiles vary by municipality in terms of value, number of units, household income, and ownership. What is important to highlight here is that over 50% of the housing units in the state include residents who are low income and moderate income. Of the 1.1 million single-family homes in the state, nearly 900,000 are owner-occupied, of which 90% are white, 7% Hispanic, and only 3% Black-owned, in comparison to the makeup of the population of 81% white, 14% Hispanic, and 5% Black. There are nearly 450,000 housing units for low-income families, of which nearly 2/3 rent, and the majority of which reside in multifamily affordable housing. There is a significant opportunity to mobilize private investment and deployment of residential solar in low-income and disadvantaged communities in Connecticut to enable access to affordable, resilient, and clean solar energy. Now let me turn it back over to Brian Garcia, who's going to talk about public policy in the state.
Thank you, Sergio. Thank you for that overview. Understanding the solar potential, as well as the energy and housing markets, are important foundations to residential solar, let me provide a quick overview of residential solar public policy in Connecticut over the last decade to give those of you webinar attendees from outside Connecticut on a perspective and the role of public policy and what it plays to support residential solar markets. Let's go to the next slide. Great, thank you, Rudy. So just to start off, the first two bullets here are public policies that were really created back in 1998 through the passage of Public Act 9828. This was when the state deregulated its electric industry, separating generation from transmission and distribution, and we have competition on generation rates. This is also the legislation that created the Renewable Energy Investment Fund, one of the sources of public revenues, in this case, ratepayer revenues that the Connecticut Green Bank administers. This policy created a net metering policy within it. So that's our net metering policy, conventional as we all think about net metering. It also included a renewable portfolio standard that includes a 40% by 2030 target for Class 1 resources. Class 1 resources include zero emission solar technologies. So we go from 1998 to then 2007, where we had two other additional incentives that help encourage more renewable energy deployment. And that is the sales and use tax exemptions, as well as the property tax exemptions that were included in Public Act 07242. Then we get to 2011 with the passage of Public Act 1180. This was a really important clean energy policy. There were some 135, 136 sections within that bill. Section 99 of that bill was the creation of the Connecticut Green Bank, but it also included the Residential Solar Investment Program. Let's go to the next slide. The RSIP, as we call it, was section 106 of that bill, and it required the Connecticut Green Bank to administer a residential solar investment program that would deliver no less than 30 megawatts of new residential solar by the end of 2022. Sergio is going to get into the incentive structure here in a second, but one of the key public policy principles within the Public Act 1180, Section 106, was fostering the sustained orderly development of a local solar industry. That was really an important inclusion by the legislature because it signaled that the deployment was not only important, but also helping to ensure that we've developed an orderly local solar industry was important as well. Then in 2015, a policy was passed expanding the RSIP from 30 megawatts to 300 megawatts, and it did a number of really interesting things. It allowed the electric distribution companies to purchase solar home renewable energy credits from the Green Bank. So the Green Bank provides incentives for families and third-party owners to install solar. We retain the renewable energy credits from those systems. We then are able to sell those credits to the utilities through a 15-year master purchase agreement. Sergio will talk about that in a sec. And then that will help us deliver no more than 300 megawatts by the end of 2022. So the legislature came in with a 10 times increase in the goal. Then in 2019, the legislature expanded that target by an additional 50 megawatts from 300 to 350. So that is some of the policy underpinnings of our residential solar market here in Connecticut. I'm now going to turn it back over to Sergio, Dan, and Lee, who are going to delve deeper into how the incentive program worked and then how the incentive program performed. Sergio.
Well, I'm having some issues here. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you and see you, Sergio. Yep.
All right. Next slide, please. So here you can see how we administered the the upfront incentive in the RCEP program. It was structured as a declining block structure. We had three different segments. We have an EPBB payment, or expected production, expected performance-based incentive that was paid to installers for systems that were to be owned by customers or homeowners. And we had two other segments. We had the PBI, the performance-based incentive, that was paid to the installers, and that would enter into PPAs or leases with the homeowners for the electricity produced by those systems. And we had the highest of the three incentives targeting low and moderate income families. Again, electricity produced by those systems was sold to homeowners by what we call the TPOs, or third-party owners. You can see how we went declining in the incentives as to create a sustainable industry in the state, a solar PV industry in the state. Next slide, please. From 2012 through 2022, the Connecticut Green Bank, in partnership with a network of contractors and inspectors, through RCEP, helped more than 46,000 families access residential solar, delivering significant social and environmental impact. The investment in residential solar is a key input into realizing social and environmental impacts. 1.4 billion of total investments, including 156 million of incentives through the RCEP, 378 megawatts of residential solar deployment on 46,350 homes, 16,355 direct, indirect, and induced job, $44.5 million in sales, individual and corporate tax revenues. Next slide.
Great. I think we're going to now turn it. Thank you, Sergio. Thank you for that overview. I think we're going to turn this over to Dan and Lee now from Slipstream, who are going to talk about the impact from that investment. Thank you, Sergio.
All right. Thank you very much. My name is Dan Stride. I'm a senior researcher at Slipstream. Slipstream is a nonprofit organization that's engaged in creating climate solutions for everyone. I'm also joined by my colleague Lee Shaver, who's a senior engineer with the organization. We've appreciated the opportunity to evaluate the RCEP program and also to provide some recommendations to the Green Bank. As may have been noted previously, the RCEP achieved its 350 megawatt objective, and so now the state is in a time of transition to a new structure, and so part of our role is to provide some recommendations there as well. Next slide, please. So there were three objectives for the evaluation that are connected to the focus of today's webinar. First, we were asked to assess the impact of RCEP on the state's residential solar market. We looked at the overall impact of the program during its 10-year life cycle, as well as trends in participation and production during that time. recognizing that residential solar is not equally accessible to all Connecticut residents. We also evaluated how equitably the program was delivered. Next, given concurrent transformation of the solar market globally, nationally, regionally, during the past 1 to 2 decades, RCEP's impact on the market needed to be understood within that context. We couldn't simply say that solar adoption rates increased in the state and therefore RCEP was a success, because that trend happened nationally, including in areas that were not supported by state or utility programs. To investigate the program's effectiveness, we compared its production and overall rates of solar adoption to equivalent metrics in other states in the region, as well as to national trends. Once again, we looked at overall adoption rates as well as who was participating in each location. And then lastly, we were asked to offer recommendations on how the Green Bank can support the residential solar market post-RCEP. And how other states might apply some of the lessons learned from RCEP to support solar markets, market transformation in those states. Next slide, please. So we went about this work by first doing our background research. We wanted to fully understand the Green Bank's existing evaluation framework. And then we were also recognizing the need to compare very different incentive structures that are used across the country and across the region for promoting the adoption of residential solar and finding meaningful ways of comparing the impacts there. Next, we dove into the RCEP data. There's a lot of it. There are 46,651 projects completed through the program, and over 200 data points were collected on each of those projects. There's a lot of data there. We used that project data to quantify RCEP's energy and non-energy impacts, as well as trends in how those impacts evolved over time. In addition to looking at the added capacity and energy production, we also wanted to understand how effectively public investment leveraged private investment, as well as at the environmental and economic benefits that the installed solar generated. Then, to support an effective comparison of the program's impact to parallel programs elsewhere, we looked at external data. We obtained and analyzed data from all the states and programs in the Northeast, as well as New York and New Jersey. That was a significant task. After collecting that data, we converted various incentive structures to common impact metrics, such as overall public investment per watt of added capacity, as well as public investment per ton of emissions avoided. In addition to the program and state level data, we also accessed large-scale data from the Energy Information Administration, Lawrence Berkeley Labs, and the Solar Energy Industries Association. Then lastly, we undertook a number of stakeholder interviews. We obtained qualitative insights from key stakeholders in the Connecticut market, included both electric utilities, representatives of organizations that are key stakeholders, including the Solarize Connecticut or Smart Power and the Connecticut Solar and Storage Association. And then also connected with regulators and utilities in other states so that we were sure that we had a clear understanding of the programs there. Next slide, please. And I am going to hand off to Lee, who will bring us through the next few slides.
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate the intro there. Yeah, so we'll take a look at the adoption rate, kind of two different ways to see the impact of the program. So here we're looking at the adoptions per 1,000 residents. The solid lime green line there is the rate for Connecticut. So this is new adoptions per 1,000 residents per year. And then that dotted line is the national rate. So you can see from 2010 to about 2014 or so, Connecticut essentially tracks the national rate, but then in 2015, the rate of adoption in Connecticut begins to exceed the national rate at an accelerating rate going forward up to the present. So what happened in 2015, as Brian explained, is there was that increase in the mandate from 30 megawatts up to 300 megawatts, which caused the RCIP program activities to really accelerate, and you can see the impact on the rate there as well. There was also the performance-based incentive that was added for low to moderate income residents. It was recognized that the rate of adoption in that population was lagging, so there was a change in the program to increase the adoption rate there. Next slide. So here, this is a slightly different way to look at the same data. So instead of adoptions per resident, so just looking at the number of solar PV systems installed, this is actually looking at watts per capita. So this is total capacity. And here we can also see a comparison to the other New England states that Dan mentioned. So the interesting thing to note here, obviously, we still see that accelerating rate in 2014 or 15 above the national average. And you can see initially other states in the region also showed a similar increase at that time. But in this chart, it's notable that from about 2017 onward, Connecticut continues to exceed the national rate, while some of the other regional states tend back towards the national average after that point. Next slide. Obviously, as solar panels are installed, less power from the grid is used, and as Sergio mentioned, there's a lot of power coming from natural gas in the region, so there's a benefit to that switch of reduced greenhouse gas emissions. We looked at the lifetime impact of solar panels, assuming a 25-year lifespan of each solar panel. What is the lifetime impact on carbon emissions, the chart on the left, and then on the right, other tracked emissions as well, including particulate matter, nitrous oxide, and sulfur dioxide. So through the RCIP program, there's significant and durable reduced GHG and particulate emissions, which of course have both local and global impacts. Next slide. So some of the economic impacts that Dan mentioned are shown on the charts here on the left is the leverage. So what we're seeing here is for every dollar that is spent through RCIP incentives, how much private investment is activated. There's a few different ways to look at that, of course, but the analysis here we see our leverage ratio of 8.15. And then obviously job creation in that chart on the right. We looked at annual job years that were created through each year of the program. You can see that the program catalyzed growth of the solar industry and grew the clean energy sector jobs. Next slide. All right, and now I'll turn it back over to Dan to talk about program efficiency. Dan, are you hopping back on, or? I think we might have lost Dan. I can cover this slide while he's sorting out his issues there. This is just showing how over time the level of investment in the incentives reduces while still maintaining the same level of solar adoption. So the goal is that initially there's a high level of investment, and then over time that level of investment can reduce. And you can see that the RCIP strategy of using well, we've made an equivalent to ZREC here. You can see that over time that investment level decreased, whereas some other strategies for ZRECs and LRECs would have not decreased the same rate over time.
Yeah, thank you, Lee, and I apologize. I had a little bit of a computer glitch here, but yeah, I just wanted to call out that we did also look at the efficiency, recognizing that the Green Bank is using using public funds in the form of customer incentives. It was important to understand how efficiently that was happening. just to call out that the RCIP program is one of several strategies or programs that were used in Connecticut to support greater adoption of solar in both the residential and commercial sectors. These used different program approaches in terms of fixed prices for RECs versus auction-based or competitive bidding-based. There were some other differences in how those were deployed, and so what we did was compare the REC cost equivalent of each of those strategies, and as is noted here, we found that RCIP performed very well in terms of looking at the amount of clean energy generated in comparison to the overall cost of the public investment. I did also, before we move to the next slide, notice something on a previous slide that was I wanted to circle back to, and that is on the avoided emissions slide. One more back here. I just wanted to make sure. It looks like there was something happening with the display, but to avoid any confusion, there was no finding of negative avoided emissions or negative generation there, as might be suggested by the negative 100 on the left vertical axis. So apologies for the difficulty in the display there. But thank you. We can move on to this slide. So the Green Bank had goals of using RCIP to both mature the solar market overall by accelerating levels of adoption, but also to ensure that there was equitable adoption across the state of a technology, solar PV, for which national rates of adoption have certainly skewed in favor of more affluent homeowners. So we wanted to understand who was benefiting from solar in Connecticut. This chart shows that supporting access to solar for all Connecticut residents was, as we said, an important goal for the Green Bank in the program. This chart shows that there was success. The dotted line on this chart is the national average for the percentage of solar installations that took place in census tracts for which the median income in that tract was less than the area median income. The bottom of the yellow bands on the vertical bars is the equivalent data point for Connecticut. And so you can see that right until around that time of the introduction of the low and moderate income performance-based incentive, LMI PBI, that was tracking, Connecticut was tracking more or less on par with the rest of the country and the share of residential solar that was happening in low and moderate income communities. But both through the introduction of the low and moderate income enhanced performance-based incentive, as well as direct and intentional engagement with organizations that were focused on bringing solar to low and moderate income communities. A couple of those organizations, Smart Power and Posigen, I think may be on the call today. So they were certainly key actors in this. And so at that point, that turning point, you can see that from there, the share of low and moderate income adoption in the state starts to really pull away from, in a good direction, the national averages. Now, while we, I'll just leave that there. Next slide, please. So there was also a recognition that while household income is a significant factor in determining whether a homeowner can and will install solar, it's not the only influence. As one of the stakeholders said in an interview for the evaluation, that solar is sold and not bought. This was intended to mean that offering enhanced financial support for low-income residents might, on its own, not be sufficient to facilitate increased participation by low and moderate income households. It's also important for solar installers and developers to engage with vulnerable communities where they might otherwise have a disincentive because the sales process, due to lack of financial resources, credit issues, other structural issues in the house, it might be more challenging than in more affluent communities. As mentioned on the previous slide, the Green Bank invested in partnerships with businesses and organizations that focused on selling solar in vulnerable communities. To understand the impact of this strategy, whether it was a success, the data tracked whether participation in 5 community designations. Those were environmental justice communities, Justice 40 communities, distressed communities, vulnerable communities, and CRA or Community Reinvestment Act eligible communities, as well as by the majority race in each census tract. This chart shows 3 of those categories of community designations. It's notable that the Justice 40 designation, which is central to federal policy, and the vulnerable community designation, which is an important part of designator and Connecticut state level policy, and then also CRA eligibility, which is very relevant for private sector financial institutions. Those are all shown here, and you can see upticks in participation among all of those communities starting at that time of greater engagement around 2015. Next slide, please. So in addition to tracking participation in various categories of community noted on the previous slide, the Green Bank used census data to identify the majority race in each census tract in the state. The program did not ask participants to identify the race, but it did track the majority race in the census tract where the project was installed. The chart on the left shows that participation by low and moderate income households in majority Black and majority Hispanic tracts increased throughout the program. It also shows that the 2015 interventions facilitated increased adoption in low and moderate income tracts across all tract racial groupings. The chart on the right shows cumulative participation data throughout the full lifetime of the program and compares the level of RCIP participation, so the percentage of all RCIP projects that fell into a given category, to the overall distribution of owner-occupied 1 to 4 unit housing within the same category. The chart shows that RCIP participation in census tracts with income below 80% of the area median income exceeded the applicable homeownership rate for all races. Next slide, please. So also certainly relevant, it's not so helpful to bring increased solar adoption in low and moderate income communities if it's not actually bringing a benefit to those who adopt or those who install solar panels. So one part of the Green Bank's evaluation framework recognizes that an investment in solar is an investment. There are costs or expenses by the household that need to be weighed against the benefits that are achieved through the solar power that's produced. Framework directs that expenses for leases as well as for power purchase agreements need to be weighed against the value of the reduced energy purchases that the solar enables. This chart shows the rate of the energy savings as well as the cost savings realized by income qualified households, those who use the low and moderate income performance-based incentive, as well as by all households in low and moderate income census tracts. The bars on the chart show the annual cost savings by low income households, and the line shows the percentage of the household's electricity that the PV was able to offset. The chart reflects that average electric savings or electric offset was about 70 to 80% for all years of the program. And then while the actual energy cost or energy cost savings varied between years. There were meaningful energy cost savings across all years, which should contribute to reduced levels of overall energy burden. Next slide, please. So the program sought to be effective, efficient, and equitable. This chart tries to bring together all three of those objectives into one picture. It shows that the strategy of initially providing a high level of incentive, initial high investment rates in program incentives in combination with the long-term commitment to the market that increased from 30 megawatts up to 300 megawatts and later to 350, those factors combined to increase the rate, the amount of capacity quite quickly that the program was generating, while at the same time bringing down the installed cost for solar in the state, as well as the incentive cost cost of the incentive per watt of added capacity. And then the yellow bars show that this did involve all income sectors, and so was speaking to the objective of equitable deployment across the state. Next slide, please. So we're going to wrap up the evaluation section of the webinar with looking at some of the key takeaways about what has supported the orderly and sustainable development of the Connecticut residential solar market, and as well as some direction post RCIP. Next slide, please. So some of the keys to success. Repeatedly throughout the stakeholder interviews, we heard from those with whom we were speaking that the Green Bank functioned as a trusted convener in the industry. It seemed that this role of bringing together utilities, community-focused organizations, solar developers, and others, bringing everybody to the table to address challenges to the industry was vital. This was especially notable as multiple people recognized that this interaction, this ability to come together and solve problems wouldn't have happened it wouldn't have happened naturally in the absence of the Green Bank's intervention. So that certainly came to the surface as one of the keys to success for the program. Then, as has been noted previously, the long-term commitment made by increasing the program's capacity tenfold from up to 300 megawatts, and then later above that, that sent a clear signal to the market to invest in developing the state's solar industry. It made sense to start to build a business in the state to bring solar to people, because it seemed like there was going to be a program framework that would be there as a support mechanism for an extended period of time. The third item is that the Green Bank identified and helped to address market failures. One of those market failures is that there's a natural disincentive for developers to invest in low and moderate income communities. It's much easier to do sales elsewhere, and so the Green Bank saw this potential for market failure and intervened to create structure that could support increased adoption in areas that might otherwise be left behind. Then lastly, the declining incentive steps tracked the maturation of the market, and as well as the declining installed cost of solar in the state and nationally, so that the RCIP could offer an efficient incentive level that led to installations continuing even after RCIP expired or met its objective. Next slide, please. I think we have our Q&A slide here, but I believe that we're going to actually go into questions at the end. So thank you.
All right, Dan, Lee, thank you for that. Sergio, thank you for that. By making the residential solar more affordable and accessible to low-income and disadvantaged communities through incentives and financing programs, which we're going to get to next time, we can mobilize more private investment to increase and accelerate deployment. We saw that in some of the curves there that Dan shared with us. Incentive programs can be effective, efficient, and equitable. Let's go to the next slide. So we can have incentive programs, but we also need partnerships with industry, the contractors and third-party capital providers. Dan showed a slide there. The Connecticut Solar and Storage Association and its members were instrumental in delivering the results we just heard from Sergio, Dan, and Lee. And even though we're making progress, we're only 5 to 10% penetration. You saw that in some of the data. So we have so much more to go. When you think about 1.4 billion only achieves 5 to 10% of the market potential, we have so much more investment to mobilize. So as we all think about solar for all, from the greenhouse gas reduction perspective, I wanted to share a few additional thoughts with you. $7 billion of funding will be expended through the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund through Solar for All. So don't be afraid to ask for data from customers and contractors. For every project, we collected more than 200 data points, and we have access to revenue grade meters to monitor the performance of those systems. We're going to share with you why that's important next time, why having revenue grade meter data is important as we delve into financing next month. So don't be afraid to collect data. Community-based marketing also works. Engage those community-based nonprofits and local neighborhood ambassadors. There have been solarized campaigns across this country. We've partnered with Smart Power and Yale University over the years to run such campaigns in our communities. They're now doing solar plus storage campaigns in Connecticut. Smart Power, as I recently learned, is now doing Solarize at Work, because where we work is also a community, and employers want their employees to not only have fair compensation and health benefits, but now they're increasingly providing sustainability benefits as well and providing additional incentives. So start to take a look at Solarize at Work. And lastly, yes, community engagement matters. The EPA and DOE have outstanding technical assistance programs to help communities develop and implement energy programs and seek financial assistance. For example, here in Bridgeport, Connecticut, we were one of 24 communities selected by the Department of Energy Communities LEAP program, Local Energy Action Plan pilot program. And Bridgeport is receiving technical assistance from the National Renewable Energy Lab and a subcontractor called Elevate. UConn, our University of Connecticut, was recently selected by the EPA to serve as the Region 1 Technical Assistance Hub for Environmental Justice Thriving Communities Technical Assistance Centers. So take a look at UConn too, folks here in Connecticut. With the IRA, its tax credits and the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, we can lift up our low-income and disadvantaged communities and enable them to realize the benefits of the green economy we're creating. Next slide, Rudy. So this webinar is one way we wanted to share with you the lessons learned from implementing a residential solar incentive program. We've also created a more in-depth story that brings a lot of data and visualizations into this as well. And I'll ask Rudy, maybe you can chat that through to our webinar attendees. It will be linked through this PowerPoint presentation as well. There, we also invite your public comments on the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund's Solar for All competition and any thoughts that you might have with respect to residential solar in Connecticut or the Residential Solar Investment Program. Next slide. We're going to continue to share lessons. Next time, we're going to delve into our second webinar on residential loans. So join us on Monday, June 5th from noon to 1 Eastern Standard Time. We're going to look at levelized costs of energy, debt service payments, and how a loan can reduce energy burden by increasing access to residential solar. Then in August, we'll delve into our third webinar on residential solar leases and power purchase agreements. So join us on Thursday, August 3rd from noon to 1. We're going to look at how third-party owned systems can deliver immediate access to residential solar in low-income and disadvantaged communities and immediate energy burden reduction. And lastly, because Connecticut's residential solar and storage market and public policy and incentive programs are in transition, and we're implementing Connecticut's version of community solar that we call shared clean energy facilities, we're likely going to schedule a fourth webinar to talk about residential renewable energy solutions, energy storage solutions, and shared clean energy facilities with a focus on low-income and disadvantaged communities, including what we believe to be an important solution for affordable housing. So stay tuned for that. So thank you all for being with us today to share lessons learned together. This is just one program. We're just one state. We look forward to learning from others too, so that we may together enable massive investment in and deployment of solar and storage to vulnerable communities across this nation. Let me turn this back over to you, Rudy, for any questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you all, Sergio and Dan and Lee, for that great presentation. We've had a couple of questions that have come in. People have asked if the slides will be available to folks who joined today, and they will. We will send out a follow-up email with the link to the slides, as well as this recording and the story map that hopefully you guys are all checking out right now. Lots of great data to dive into there. So I know we only have a couple minutes, so we're just gonna answer some questions. If you have them, please put them into the chat. If we don't answer them here, we will follow up with you after the fact. The first question that we received was, does the cost savings include the payments for the PV systems? So in the analysis that Slipstream provided.
Sure, this is Dan. I can answer that. Yes, for projects that are financed with a lease or installed through a PPA, a power purchase agreement, the costs of the lease or of the energy costs in the PPA is included in that analysis. I don't recall the slide number on that, but there was one that showed included both the energy cost savings as well as the electrical offset.
And I would just add, that's a great question. We're going to come back to that next time with loans and then following with leases and PPAs, because again, on the data collection side, we have all the contracts that contractors and third-party owners engage in with those end-use customers. So we know what their monthly lease rates are, what their escalators are. We have meters on every one of those systems, so we know how they're performing, and we have electric rates. So we know how much those families are actually saving after they're paying for their lease or debt service payments. So stay tuned. We're going to share that data next time.
Thank you both. This question seems like a policy question, Brian. Will the small commercial be fixed so that it can stay open longer than 24 hours?
Okay, good question. So this is a Connecticut stakeholder, and just to give, let me try to take a stab at this. There are the residential and non-residential markets are different in Connecticut. The residential market does not have caps, megawatt capacity caps. Whatever the market can deliver, the incentive structure could handle. In the non-residential side, there are caps. I believe it's a 100 megawatt a year cap for small, medium, and large installations. And it sounds like the process, as Dan was speaking about before, in terms of a competitive auction, is a one-day process for the small projects. I believe in Connecticut, still those small projects are price takers, meaning whatever the medium and large projects are in those competitions sets a price that the small projects then take. Now, there may be a lot of small projects in queue that when the bell starts, everyone submits in, and that queue may fill up really quickly, leaving those who are unable to be in the queue or receive some sort of lottery allocation are unable to participate. So little things that working through on the policy side on small business.
Great. Thank you, Brian. A question about Connecticut's forest and tree coverage here. How significant is solar access issues with 60% of the state being covered in forests and trees?
I think it's a big deal, but that is one of the beauties of our state. That's one of the beauties of all the northeastern U.S. I'm born and raised in Southern California. When my family comes out here, they always say it's really, really green there. And that's what we love about New England and the Northeast. We get beautiful fall foliage and all of those things. So I think when we looked at the geostellar technical potential, they tried to factor that in. I think they sized any system greater than a 3 kW system would technically fall into the bucket. So still at that technical potential, we had more than 6 gigawatts of potential, and then you do the economic potential and it comes down to 3.5, as Sergio was speaking about. But we definitely don't want people cutting down those trees just to put up solar panels, right? So I think every family deals with that question very differently, because obviously those trees provide shade. Shade provides cooling in the home. Cooling is really important when your home's weatherized and you're using a heat pump, right? So you're getting to efficiency. Yeah, it's a challenge for Connecticut, but as Sergio noted, given the limited solar potential but the high electric rates, there's an economic rationale for why homeowners would want to pursue solar in our state.
Great, thank you, Brian. So I think we're a little bit over time. We're going to end with this last question, which is a great segue to future webinar topics. We had mentioned shared clean energy solutions in an earlier slide. Can you just give a little bit more context about what that might mean for folks here, Brian?
So in the context of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund's Solar for All program, I mentioned the 4 different areas that they would support. One of them was community solar. Connecticut's policy is actually called Shared Clean Energy Facilities. So it is our version of community solar. It's technology agnostic, but it also works differently than other community solar projects where people subscribe to a project and receive the benefits from that system. In Connecticut, there's a bilateral agreement between a developer of a community solar project and the utility. So they sign an agreement for 20 years for the power and the environmental attributes. So that's just a one-on-one relationship, very powerful. Procurement, long-term with the utility can help you finance a project. Then the power that's produced from those systems, on the other end, we have low to moderate income families who would benefit from a 2.5 cent per kilowatt hour subscriber credit. So if you are lucky enough to be selected as a subscriber, then for the next 20 years, you're going to receive that 2.5 cent credit based on what your electric consumption is. So it will help you save on an annual basis about $210 per year, roughly, for the average consumer in Connecticut. So we'll get into that in webinar number 4.
Great, thank you very much, Brian. Thank you to Dan and Lee and Sergio for this great presentation today. And thank you for everyone who attended. We will be sending out those follow-up resources as we mentioned, and please do register for webinars 2 and 3 that are coming up in the coming months. Thank you all very much. Take care.